You're listening to the Building Psychological Strength Podcast Business Edition. My name is April Seifert. Not only am I a doctoral level psychologist, but I have been a successful entrepreneur for a number of years, and I've learned firsthand that building psychological strength can have a direct impact on your business success. In this Friday edition of the podcast, I'll offer you tools, tips, tricks, and information to help you become stronger, more resilient, and more successful. Let's get to it. Harlan Cleveland said, "Leaders are problem solvers by talent and temperament and by choice." Welcome back. If you're catching this episode, know that it is part 2 of a 2-part series focused on the psychology of sales. Now, to be absolutely clear, in this series, we're talking about the psychology of the sales person, not the psychology of your customers. That's a whole other psychology-related issue that we will definitely tackle in the future. If you missed last Friday's episode, you'll want to go back and catch it because in that episode, I lifted the curtain on why selling is such an anxiety-provoking activity for so many people. Now, a lot of us know that rejection is at the core of our fear around sales. But in last week's episode, I offered up a subtle psychological technique that you can use to help manage the emotions that arise when we fear rejection. So I hope you'll check it out if you haven't already. Okay, on to this week's show. I mentioned last week in that episode that I love sales. And I know how absolutely crazy that can sound. The reason why it's crazy is that most people fall prey to a couple of common misunderstandings, and that's what I want to cover today. So last week, we talked about the fear of rejection around sales, which is a perfect segue into the first misunderstanding that I see all the time. It is this: you are not your product or your service. I'm going to repeat that. You are not the same thing as your product or your service. Even if the service is something that you physically do, it's still a separate entity from you. And what this means is that when someone rejects your product or service, they're rejecting it, not you. The rejection reflects on your product or service and its fit or misfit with what that potential customer's current needs are. I mean, you see, business is actually really simple when you boil it down. You make money when you solve a problem for someone. Your product or service is the thing that solves the problem for the person. So if your potential customer doesn't have a problem that your product or service solves, and they don't have that problem right now, they're not going to buy. So yes, there's rejection there, but they're rejecting what you sell. They're not rejecting you. You aren't your product or your service. One practical way to start drilling this into your head is to think about peanut butter. Stay with me, I promise this is relevant. Okay, so imagine I ask you if you want some peanut butter. It is the best, the most delicious peanut butter ever, and I've got a scoop of it. I'm ready to give you a scoop of it. Are you going to say yes, or are you going to reject my offer? Well, let's think about that. Whether you say yes, it depends on a lot of things. One of them is timing. Are you even hungry right now? Peanut butter solves the problem of alleviating hunger. Do you have that problem right now? Another one is context. Maybe you are hungry, but maybe you've got some bread and a knife available. If that's the context around your hunger, you might say yes. But if you've got a plate of spaghetti in front of you, you're probably going to reject my offer. Nothing about me has anything to do with your hunger level or the context around it. Nothing. So framing that rejection in your mind is sort of a result of dozens of factors, most of which have nothing to do with you, it'll help you stay resilient in the face of rejection. So the next time you need to sell something, I want you to think about peanut butter and think about all the factors that would influence you to either say yes or to reject peanut butter. So to recap, The first misunderstanding is thinking that you are the same thing as your product or service. You are not. They're rejecting it. They're not rejecting you. There's nothing to fear here. The next is a misunderstanding about your role and what you're actually doing when you're selling. Sales, unfortunately, gets this sleazy reputation, and it comes from a very common place. You may experience some form of mental chatter that says something like, I don't like sales because I don't like pressuring people or trying to convince them to buy something. Let's go back to the fundamentals of business. You make money when you solve a problem for someone. Last I checked, solving somebody's problems is not a sleazy endeavor. Last I checked, people actually appreciate having their problems solved. Your job as a salesperson, if you are an authentically good one, if you are one with good intentions, your job as a salesperson is to solve problems. It's to determine whether a potential customer has a problem that your product or service solves, and then show them that your product or service solves that problem. That's the sales process. That's it. So going back to my peanut butter example, that salesperson could simply ask the person if they're hungry as a first step in the process. Sales is not just, hey, do you want to buy this? There's a process there. Pre-qualifying that person to determine that they do in fact have the problem that you solve can reduce the chance of a rejection later. And P.S., go back to misunderstanding number 1. Even if you get a rejection, it's okay. It's not about you. Once you've pre-qualified that person, your job is to simply demonstrate that your product or service is one way they can solve that problem. It's one way they can eliminate hunger. Spaghetti is still an option, but peanut butter is another one. So to recap, the second misunderstanding is that you're not pressuring or convincing anyone of anything. You're finding out if they have a problem and you're helping them solve it. Simple as that. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is why all of this happens. You know, we're getting to psychology. You're listening to the Building Psych Strength podcast. So obviously, I'm going to talk about the psychological reasons for these misunderstandings. And in this case, there's one core reason. It's ego. We're wired to think about ourselves. We hear our own thoughts. We live in our own minds. We are painfully aware of our own inner psychological landscape. And for most of us, it's a pretty noisy place. It's a pretty distracting place. We're so used to being caught up in our own psychological world that it's difficult for us to be present in the moment, let alone practice the extreme empathy that it takes to take the position of another person. It can be hard for us to disengage from that inner world and allow us to tap into empathy and a place of service. So knowing that, the practical step of, quote, what to do, it becomes very obvious. The next time you're gearing up for a sales call or a sales meeting, take a moment to become mindful, to get out of your head and into the present moment. And the easiest way to do this, it's very simple. It's deceptively simple. It's to use your 5 senses. Let's practice this right now. Tell me 5 things you can see right now. Look around. 5 things you can see. Now, tell me 4 things you can hear. Listen. Tell me 4 things. 3 things you can feel with your body. What are 3 things you feel? What are 2 things you can smell? How about 1 thing you can taste? Pay attention to the details of the present moment. Then once you've done that, put yourself in the shoes of your sales prospect. What do they struggle with? What do they need? How can you help them? How does your product or service help them solve a problem? Moving forward, get your mind right. before stepping into a sales conversation. You're there to serve and to solve a problem. That position of service and problem solving is why I love sales. I'm there to serve and I'm there to solve problems. Adopt that mindset. Thank you so much for joining me for this business edition of the Building Psych Strength podcast. If you're an entrepreneur, current or aspiring, and you're interested in becoming more successful, hit the subscribe button. And if you're really interested in digging in deep, visit aprilseifert.com, where you can fill out an application to see if Psych Strength business success coaching is right for you. Until next week, be strong, be resilient, and be successful.